In a recent Q&A with Ian Hezekostas, the game director for the World of Warcraft, it was mentioned that Timewalking Raids would be a feature to be included with the patch 725 of WoW Legion. Starting with Black Temple and the Burning Crusade, future raids would be included into the Timewalking mix, and it sounds like there's going to be one raid for each of the different Timewalking events. The question now is, what raid will represent each expansion? I don't have a freaking clue, but we're going to take a look at each expansion's major raids and find out. Hey, it's Soul, and we're going to take a look back at the biggest raids in the World of Warcraft from expansion to expansion. We're going to take a brief tour inside, and then we're going to talk about how this relates to Timewalking Raids, and why this raid may or may not be chosen. We're going to kick it off with Wrath of the Lich King, and we have 3 raids that'll duke it out for supremacy. But first, let's start with the raid zones that I'm sure that some of you will have fond memories of, but, well, sorry, these raids probably have a 0 chance of becoming a Timewalking raid. This includes the Obsidian and the Ruby Sanctum, the Vault of Archivon, the Eye of Eternity, and Trial of the Crusader. Now, I'm not here to knock on the raids or the encounters, and maybe in a future video I'll go really in depth with some or all of these instances, but we're looking at this series as more of a quick analysis on what would make for a good Timewalking raid. The reason why these raids don't qualify is pretty simple: they're just too short. There's almost no trash, and there's not quite enough narrative to make the case that this raid defines Wrath of the Lich King, or any other expansion for that matter. The real bruisers in today's kind of raid battle are Naxxramas, Eldora, and Icecrown Citadel. Naxxramas is a huge, sprawling raid that's almost literally pulled from Classic WoW. Okay, it literally was pulled from Classic WoW, but technically it's part of Wrath of the Lich King, and it's pretty closely tied to the Lich King, so here it is. The environment is unmistakably Scourge and brings back all sorts of classic art experiences, complete with skeletons and green goop, and of course a creepy atmosphere. The encounters in this raid by now are pretty classic and call up all sorts of traumatic experiences from both Wrath and Classic players alike. Many experiences that have to do with the encounter mechanics, such as knowing what plus and minus mean. There's watching the ground in the infamous safety dance. There are moments where you control your raid by turning it into a pretend ice block, and you'd think that it's part of the encounter, but it's not, and then you get killed, and then everyone gets mad. There's the old but pretty much required trick of using mind control during the instructor fight. There's the 4 freaking horsemen, which is still one of my most memorable experiences as a tank. And I can go on, but there are too many freaking bosses. Naxx's Timewalking raid would take a pretty long time to complete, even if the mechanics were nerfed to accommodate a pre-made group. I actually do think that the length of this raid could be a problem for some groups that aren't accustomed to just how big this is. Now remember that Naxx is the only classic style raid that was updated for Wrath and now possibly updated for Timewalking. The classic WoW raiding paradigm was that it took multiple days to complete these kinds of raids, or in other words, many more hours than the shorter and kind of more farmable raids of today. Of course, I don't mean to knock on the hardiness or the persistence of today's players, but I think it's a real question. Is Naxx too long to be a Timewalking raid? But Naxx did make for a solid, if not less challenging, initial raid for players of its time. Well, it was the hardest raid of Classic WoW, but it was the initial raid for Wrath of the Lich King. The environment again screams of necromancy and other forbidden arts, and it might not be a fan favorite raid, but it could make a good Timewalking raid. On the other hand, Eldora is argued to be one of the best raids in WoW's history, with its fresh theme, unique and memorable encounter design, and some of the more memorable voiceovers that we've heard.
I remember you. In the mountains.
Eldora is a Titan city, fortress, and prison with unique environments from one room to the next, representing its Titan-forged keepers to the madness below to frickin' space. Players loved this raid, and they still love it today, often referring to it as the benchmark to which all future raid content has been measured. There's a lot of fun with laying siege to the city in a parade of tanks and vehicles, and then battle your way to a mechanized lab complete with mecha. As famous and well-liked as this raid is though, does it, well, I guess the question for me is, does it really represent Wrath of the Lich King when the Lich King has nothing to do with this raid? Considering Timewalking, it isn't exactly about just bringing back a favorite raid, but bringing an old raid to modern times to an audience that might not have played through this expansion themselves. Part of the reason behind bringing this raid to modern times is, at least in my opinion, more nostalgia than logic. But it's a Blizzard's game and, well, they can do whatever the heck they want. There are a few technical questions to ask though. So Eldora is the first raid where hard modes were introduced, where you complete special conditions that unlock a more difficult version of the encounter. So are the hard modes going to be available in the Timewalking version of the raid, or is it even possible to not activate hard mode based on how some of them are unlocked? And then there's the optional bosses, including Algalon. Are they going to be available? Are they going to be required? That sort of thing. And all of these questions do have answers. Blizzard just has to make the call or, well, decide on a different raid altogether. Icecrown Citadel is the capstone of the Lich King raiding experience. I mean, literally, he's right there, like at the top. ICC, even though it's heavily Scourge themed, it doesn't share the same art style as Naxxramas, which is also called a necropolis, and that's a primary building from the Warcraft 3, the real-time strategy game. Instead, ICC is made out of Serenite, an ore that may apparently be a hardened form of an old god's blood. Something pleasant. Icecrown Citadel's many encounters might, well, in my opinion, it might have a bit less imagination compared to Ulduar's, and this is mainly due to the whole undeath thing being a predominant theme, while Eldora had much more freedom of expression. The fights though were still fun and technically impressive, so it'd be interesting to see how players will handle, say, Putricide Slimes, or Sindragosa's Ice Pillar things, and Defile. Oh god, Defile. And while we're on the subject, which difficulty should players experience in Timewalking Raids? Defile is painful, but so are Shadow Traps. Blizzard has the opportunity with this raid to decide on a whim which version of the encounters should Timewalking players experience. After all, it is a pre-made group, and not LFR, so there's a greater expectation, but after tuning, maybe not so much greater. Anyway, ICC was fun in it today, and it wouldn't surprise me one bit if it turned out to be the Timewalking raid that represents Wrath of the Lich King. It does round up a story that took players months to get through, and finally culminates with so much. A son is returned home, a grudge finally laid to rest, the fall of a king, and a man willingly made prisoner. You see, this shit writes itself. So these are the 3 major raids of Wrath of the Lich King, at least at a glance. Which one's your favorite? Which do you think deserves to be crowned or bastardized as the Timewalking raid? Share your thoughts. Stay tuned for more expansions and raids, and stay breezy.